Sister Margaret walked slowly down the narrow hallway of St. Catherine's Convent, her soft footsteps echoing against the old stone walls. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. She had been walking these same halls for 43 years, but today felt different. Today, she could hear the piano music drifting from the chapel, and it made her heart ache in ways she couldn't quite explain. The music stopped abruptly, followed by a frustrated sigh. Sister Margaret paused outside the chapel door, listening. As one of the younger sisters struggled through the opening notes of Amazing Grace for the third time. The melody was there, but it lacked the warmth and depth that only comes from years of practice and genuine love for the instrument. Sister Margaret remembered when she used to play that same song. Her fingers would dance across the keys with such ease that the other sisters would often stop their morning chores just to listen. The music would fill every corner of the chapel, wrapping around the wooden pews and soaring up to the vaulted ceiling like a prayer made of sound. But that was before her hands started to shake during the important moments. Before her fingers began to fumble over keys she had played thousands of times. Before Mother Superior had to make that difficult decision that changed everything. She pushed open the heavy chapel door and stepped inside. The young sister at the piano looked up with relief. "Oh, Sister Margaret, I'm so glad you're here. I just can't seem to get this right. The notes are all there, but it doesn't sound like music. It sounds like ... well, like someone just learning to play." Sister Margaret smiled gently and walked toward the piano. The instrument was old, probably 50 years or more, but it had been well cared for. The wood still gleamed with polish, and each key had been worn smooth by countless fingers over the decades. She had spent so many hours at this bench that she could probably play it with her eyes closed. "Music isn't just about hitting the right notes," Sister Margaret said, settling down beside the younger sister. "It's about feeling the story behind each song. This hymn, for example, was written by someone who had lost everything and then found hope again. When you play it, you're not just making sounds. You're sharing that journey with everyone who hears it." The young sister nodded, but Sister Margaret could see the doubt in her eyes. It was the same look she had seen on many faces over the years. People thought that music was either a gift you were born with or something you could never truly understand. But Sister Margaret knew better. She had seen ordinary people create extraordinary beauty when they opened their hearts to the music. "Would you like me to show you?" Sister Margaret asked, her fingers hovering over the keys. The young sister's face lit up with hope, but then quickly clouded over. "Oh, but Sister Margaret, Mother Superior said that you shouldn't. She was worried about your hands." Sister Margaret's smile faded slightly. She pulled her hands back into her lap and looked down at them. They were old hands now, marked with brown spots and crossed with lines that told the story of a life well lived. The knuckles were swollen, and some mornings they ached terribly. But right now, sitting here next to this beautiful instrument, they felt strong and ready. "Yes," she said quietly. "Mother Superior is very wise. She only wants what's best for everyone." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Mother Superior appeared in the doorway, her expression kind but firm. She was younger than Sister Margaret by about 15 years, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had been making difficult decisions for a long time. "Sister Margaret," she said, walking into the chapel, "I thought I might find you here. Are you helping with the music practice?" "Just offering some encouragement," Sister Margaret replied, standing up from the piano bench. "The young ones work so hard to get everything perfect." Mother Superior nodded, but her eyes were fixed on the piano. "I know how much you love music, Sister Margaret. We all do. Your playing brought so much joy to our community for so many years. but we've talked about this. The doctor said that the stress of performing might make your condition worse. We can't risk you getting hurt." Sister Margaret remembered that day clearly. It had been during the Easter service, and the chapel was packed with visitors from the community. She had been playing "Christ the Lord is Risen Today" when her hand suddenly seized up. The music stopped in the middle of a phrase, and she sat there frozen, while 200 people waited in silence. The embarrassment had been overwhelming, but worse than that was the fear she saw in the faces of the other sisters. They had watched her struggle, and they didn't know how to help. "I understand," Sister Margaret said now, stepping away from the piano. "You're right, of course. I wouldn't want to worry anyone." But as she walked away, she couldn't help but glance back at the instrument. The piano sat there in the morning light, silent and waiting. All those keys, all those possible melodies, just sitting there unused. It seemed like such a waste. Over the next few weeks, Sister Margaret found herself spending more and more time in the chapel. She would arrive early for morning prayers and stay late after evening services. She told herself she was there to pray, to meditate, to find peace in the quiet space. But really, she was there to be near the piano dot. She would sit in the front pew and watch as different sisters took turns trying to play for services. Some were better than others, but none of them seemed to truly connect with the music. They played the notes correctly, but they missed the soul of each song. A hymn sounded mechanical, like they were being played by someone who had learned the movements, but not the meaning. Sometimes, late at night, when the convent was quiet and everyone else was asleep, Sister Margaret would sit at the piano bench and place her hands on the keys. She wouldn't press them down or make any sound. She would just sit there, feeling the smooth, cool surface under her fingertips, remembering what it felt like when the music flowed through her like water through a stream. Her hands would remember the shape of different chords, the way her fingers used to stretch across the keys to reach the bass notes, while her right hand danced through the melody. She could almost hear the music in her mind, note by note, phrase by phrase. But she never actually played. She had given her word to Mother Superior, and she intended to keep it. The other sisters began to notice her spending so much time in the chapel. They would find her there in the morning, sitting quietly in the front pew, or discover her late at night, kneeling in prayer near the altar. Some of them worried that she was becoming too isolated, too focused on the past. They tried to encourage her to join other activities, to find new ways to contribute to the community. But Sister Margaret couldn't explain to them what she was feeling. How could she tell them that every time she heard someone struggle through a piece of music, her heart broke a little more? How could she explain that her hands, which had once brought so much beauty into the world, now felt useless and forgotten? She began to have dreams about playing. In these dreams, her hands were young and strong again, and the music poured out of her like sunlight. She would wake up with tears on her cheeks, her fingers still moving as if they were touching invisible keys. The dreams were so vivid that sometimes she had to look at her hands in the morning light to remind herself that they were old and stiff, and no longer capable of the magic they had once created. But even in her sadness, Sister Margaret never stopped believing in the power of music. She knew that somewhere inside her, the gift was still there, waiting for the right moment to emerge again. The autumn morning was crisp and clear when the black car pulled up outside St. Catherine's Convent. Sister Margaret was tending to the small garden near the entrance, carefully deadheading the last roses of the season. She had always found peace in gardening, the way her hands could still nurture life, even when they couldn't create music anymore. She looked up when she heard car doors closing, and saw a man in his 40s stepping out, followed by a younger woman carrying what looked like professional camera equipment. The man had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. His companion was busy checking various pieces of equipment, muttering to herself about lighting and sound levels. "Excuse." The man called out, approaching the garden gate. "I'm looking for Mother Superior. We have an appointment about a documentary project." Sister Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and smiled. "Of course. You must be the film people. Mother Superior mentioned you might be coming today. I'm Sister Margaret." "David Chun," he said, extending his hand with a warm smile. "This is my assistant Riley. We're here to learn about the musical traditions of your community." As they walked toward the main building, David found himself curious about the elderly sister beside him. There was something about the way she moved, a certain rhythm to her steps, that reminded him of musicians he had worked with over the years. It was subtle, but after 20 years in the music industry, he had learned to recognize that particular grace that came from a lifetime of working with rhythm and melody. "Have you been at the convent long?" he asked as they climbed the stone steps. 43 years, Sister Margaret replied. "I've seen many changes in that time, but the music has always been the heart of our community." Something in her voice made David pause. There was a depth there, a kind of longing that spoke of personal experience rather than just observation. But before he could ask more questions, they had reached Mother Superior's office. The meeting with Mother Superior went well. She was enthusiastic about the project and eager to share the history of their musical traditions. She spoke passionately about the role of music in their daily prayers, the way it brought the community together, and how it connected them to generations of sisters who had come before. "We have some lovely voices in our choir," Mother Superior explained, "and several sisters who play instruments. Nothing too fancy, of course, but we do our best to keep the tradition alive." David nodded, taking notes. "I'd love to capture some of that, the authenticity of it, the way music becomes part of daily spiritual life rather than just performance." "Wonderful. I can arrange for you to film during our evening prayers tonight. The acoustics in our chapel are quite beautiful." As they discussed the logistics, David found his attention wandering to the sounds coming from elsewhere in the building. He could hear piano music, hesitant and uncertain, stopping and starting as someone worked through what sounded like a hymn. The playing was technically correct, but lacked the emotional depth that would make it truly moving. "That's Sister Catherine practicing for tonight," Mother Superior said, noticing his distraction. "She's been working very hard to improve her playing. Music doesn't come naturally to everyone, but she has such dedication." "Has your community always had strong musicians?" David asked. Mother Superior's expression shifted slightly, a shadow crossing her face. "We've been blessed with some remarkable talents over the years. Sister Margaret, who showed you in, was once quite accomplished. She played for our services for decades." "Really?" David's interest was immediately piqued. "What happened? Did she stop because of age?" "Health issues," Mother Superior said carefully. "Her hands. Well, arthritis can be cruel to musicians. It was difficult for everyone when she had to step back from playing. She took it very gracefully, though. She always puts the community's needs before her own." David found himself thinking about Sister Margaret as he and Riley set up their equipment in the chapel that afternoon. The building was indeed beautiful, with soaring arches and stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns across the wooden pews. The piano sat to one side of the altar, an old but well-maintained instrument that looked like it had decades of stories to tell. "The acoustics in here are incredible," Riley said, testing her sound equipment. "Every note is going to resonate perfectly." As they worked, David noticed Sister Margaret enter the chapel. She moved quietly, carrying a vase of fresh flowers that she placed near the altar. But instead of leaving immediately, she paused near the piano, her hand resting briefly on its polished surface. The gesture was so gentle, so full of longing, that David felt his heart constrict. She must have sensed his watching, because she looked up and caught his eye. For just a moment, her carefully composed expression slipped, and he saw something raw and painful there. Then she smiled politely and continued with her work. "Sister Margaret," he called out impulsively, "could I ask you something?" She approached. Cautiously, "Of course. Mother Superior mentioned that you used to play piano. What was that like?" Her hands, which had been clasped in front of her, began to move slightly, as if they were remembering something. It was like breathing," she said softly. "For so many years, it was just part of who I was. Every morning, every evening, the music was there. Do you miss it?" The question seemed to surprise her. She looked down at her hands, studying them as if seeing them for the first time. "I try not to think about it too much. What's done is done. There's no point in dwelling on what we can't change." But David could see that she was thinking about it. Her eyes had drifted to the piano, and her fingers were moving in tiny, almost imperceptible patterns. He had seen this before in musicians who had been forced to stop playing. The muscle memory never really went away. "Would you mind if I asked what pieces you used to play?" Sister Margaret's face lit up for the first time since they had started. "Talking. Oh, everything. The hymns, of course, but also classical pieces. Chopin was always my favorite. There's something about his music that speaks directly to the soul. The Minute Waltz?" "Yes." The word came out with such enthusiasm that she immediately looked embarrassed. "I mean, yes, I used to play that one often. It was one of my favorites." David watched as she unconsciously swayed slightly, as if hearing music that only she could perceive. Her whole body seemed to come alive when she talked about playing, as if discussing music awakened something that had been sleeping inside her. "Sister Margaret," he said gently, "I know this might be presumptuous, and I understand if you say no, but would you consider playing something for the documentary? Just a simple piece, nothing stressful. I think it would add so much to understand the musical heritage of this place." The hope that flashed across her face was quickly replaced by uncertainty. "Oh, I couldn't. Mother Superior has been very clear that it's better if I don't play anymore. My hands aren't reliable. I wouldn't want to embarrass myself or the community. But surely just for a moment. Nothing formal, nothing that would put pressure on you?" Sister Margaret glanced around the empty chapel, then back at the piano. He could see the war going on inside her, the desperate desire to touch those keys. Again, battling against years of being told that she was no longer capable. "I appreciate the thought," she said finally, "but I think it's better this way. The younger sisters need to have their chance to shine. My time has passed." But even as she said the words, David could see that she didn't believe them. And as she walked away, he noticed something that confirmed his suspicions. Her footsteps, which had seemed ordinary when he first met her, now had a definite rhythm to them. Not just any rhythm, but specifically the rhythm of Chopin's Minute Waltz. Was still a musician. Every fiber of her being proclaimed it. And somehow, David was determined to help her remember that. The evening filming had gone well, but David couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The choir had sung beautifully, and Sister Catherine had managed to play the hymns without any major mistakes. But there was something hollow about it all, like watching a beautiful painting that had somehow lost its color's dot as he packed up his equipment. David kept thinking about his conversation with Sister Margaret earlier that day. The way her eyes had lit up when she talked about Chopin, the unconscious swaying of her body, the rhythm in her footsteps. Everything about her screamed musician, yet she had been convinced she could no longer play. "I think we got some good footage," Riley said, coiling up the last of the cables. "The acoustics really are amazing in here." "Yeah," David replied absently, still looking at the piano. "Listen, why don't you head back to the hotel? I want to stay here a little longer, Maybe get some shots of the chapel in the evening light. Riley raised an eyebrow. You sure? We've got plenty of B-roll already. I know. I just have a feeling about this place. Something special might happen. After Riley left, David sat alone in the chapel as the last light of day filtered through the stained glass windows. The convent was settling into its evening rhythm. He could hear the soft sounds of sisters moving through the hallways, doors, closing quietly, the gentle murmur of evening prayers beginning in distant rooms. He had set up one camera on a tripod, pointing toward the piano, just in case. It was a long shot, but 20 years in documentary filmmaking had taught him that the most powerful moments often came when people thought no one was watching. The chapel grew darker as the sun set. David was starting to think he should give up and head back to the hotel when he heard footsteps in the hallway. Soft, hesitant footsteps that seemed to pause outside the chapel door. David quickly moved to a pew near the back of the chapel, making himself as invisible as possible. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and Sister Margaret slipped inside. She looked around carefully, as if making sure she was truly alone, then closed the door behind her with barely a sound. For a long moment, she just stood there in the dim light filtering through the windows. Then, almost like she was being pulled by some invisible force, she began walking toward the piano. David held his breath. His camera was running, but he didn't dare move to adjust it. Whatever was about to happen, he knew it was sacred in a way that had nothing to do with the building they were in. Sister Margaret reached the piano bench and stood beside it for what felt like an eternity. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and David could see them trembling slightly. She was fighting some internal battle, torn between desire and duty, between the pull of the music and the voice in her head telling her she wasn't good enough anymore. Finally, she sat down on the bench. The movement was slow, careful, like someone handling something precious and fragile. She placed her hands on her lap and stared at the keys in front of her. Just once, she whispered to herself, so quietly that David almost didn't hear her. Just to see if I remember. Her hands rose toward the keys, then stopped. She pulled them back, shaking her head. No, I can't. What if someone hears? What if I make a fool of myself? But the piano seemed to be calling to her. In the quiet of the chapel, David could almost feel the instrument's patient presence, waiting for her touch after so many months of silence. Sister Margaret tried to stand up, to walk away, but she couldn't do it. Instead, she placed her hands on the keys without pressing them down, just feeling their familiar shape under her fingers. I used to know you so well, she said to the piano, her voice thick with emotion. Every key, every sound you could make. We were partners, weren't we? You and I, making music together. Her fingers began to move slightly, not enough to make sound, but tracing the patterns of melodies she remembered. David watched, fascinated, as decades of muscle memory began to awaken. The minute waltz, she murmured. I must have played you 1,000 times. Do you remember how we used to make the chapel ring with that music? As if the piano had answered her, Sister Margaret suddenly pressed down on a single key. The note rang out clear and pure in the silent chapel, hanging in the air like a question waiting to be answered. The sound seemed to break something loose inside her. Before she could stop herself, her right hand began picking out the opening melody of Chopin's Minute Waltz. Slow at first, tentative, as if she was asking permission from her own fingers. The melody was simple, just a few notes, but they were perfect. Each one rang out with clarity and precision that spoke of decades of practice and natural talent. As the notes filled the chapel, Sister Margaret's posture began to change. Her back straightened, her shoulders relaxed, and a look of wonder spread across her face. Oh, she breathed. Oh, my hands remember. Encouraged by this small success, she added her left hand, filling in the bass notes that gave the melody its foundation. The music began to take on life, growing from a tentative question into a confident statement. David watched in amazement as the transformation continued. With each measure, Sister Margaret seemed to shed years of doubt and resignation. Her hands, which had looked so frail and uncertain just moments before, now moved with the grace and precision of a master musician. The minute waltz began to accelerate as Chopin had intended. Sister Margaret's fingers danced across the keys with increasing confidence, navigating the complex passages as if she had played them just yesterday instead of months ago. The music filled every corner of the chapel, rich and full and absolutely beautiful. But more than the technical perfection, what struck David most was the joy radiating from Sister Margaret. Her face was transformed, years of sadness and frustration melting away as the music poured out of her. This wasn't just an elderly woman playing piano. This was an artist reuniting with her greatest love, Dot, as the piece built toward its climax. Sister Margaret's playing became more bold, more expressive. She wasn't just hitting the right notes anymore. She was telling a story, painting pictures with sound, sharing emotions that words could never capture. The final notes of the minute waltz rang out in the chapel, and Sister Margaret sat in stunned silence, her hands still poised over the keys. Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling the most radiant smile David had ever seen. "I can still play," she whispered to herself. "After all this time, all this doubt, I can still play." But instead of stopping, she launched into Bach's Jesu, joy of man's desiring, her fingers finding the familiar patterns with ease. The music was different from Chopin, more meditative, more spiritual, but no less beautiful. David realized he was crying too. In 20 years of documenting musicians, he had never witnessed anything like this. This wasn't just a performance. It was a resurrection, a rediscovery of a gift that had never truly been lost, Dot, as Sister Margaret continued playing. Moving from Bach to Mozart, to pieces David didn't recognize, the chapel seemed to come alive around her. The music echoed off. The stone walls danced among the rafters, and seemed to make the stained glass windows glow with their own inner light. This was what had been missing from the evening's filming. This was the soul of music, the reason why it mattered, why it had the power to change lives and touch hearts across centuries and cultures. Sister Margaret was no longer an elderly woman with arthritis. She was music itself, given human form. Sister Margaret's hands continued to move across the keys with a confidence that seemed to surprise even her. After finishing the Bach piece, she paused for a moment, flexing her fingers and staring at them with wonder. It was as if she was seeing them clearly for the first time in months. How is this possible? She whispered to herself. This morning I could barely hold my prayer book steady, and now she began to play again, this time choosing a piece that had always been close to her heart. It was a simple hymn, "How Great Thou Art," but she played it with such depth and feeling that it sounded like it was being born for the very first time. Each note carried weight and meaning, telling the story of a faith that had sustained her through decades of service. From his position in the back pew, David watched this transformation with growing amazement. He had filmed hundreds of musicians over the years, from nervous beginners to world-renowned masters, but he had never seen anything quite like this. Sister Margaret wasn't just playing music. She was pouring her entire soul into every note. As she moved into the second verse of the hymn, the chapel door creaked open. Sister Catherine, the young sister who had been struggling with her piano practice earlier, slipped inside. She had probably come for evening prayers, but when she heard the music, she froze in the doorway. Her mouth fell open in shock. She had never heard Sister Margaret play before, only heard stories from the older sisters about how beautiful her music used to be. But this wasn't just beautiful. This was extraordinary, Sister Catherine tried to back out quietly, not wanting to disturb what was clearly a private moment, but her foot caught the edge of the heavy door. It made a soft scraping sound, and Sister Margaret's hands stopped mid-phrase. The silence that followed was deafening. Sister Margaret turned slowly on the piano bench, her face a mixture of embarrassment and fear. When she saw Sister Catherine standing there, her cheeks flushed red. "I'm sorry," Sister Margaret said quickly. "I know I'm not supposed to ... I was just ... I couldn't help myself." But Sister Catherine wasn't looking at her with disapproval. Instead, tears were streaming down the young woman's face. "Sister Margaret," she said in a voice filled with awe, "that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. How ... How did you do that? This morning you said your hands weren't working properly anymore." Sister Margaret looked down at her hands again, confusion written across her face. "I don't understand it either. When I'm being watched, when there's pressure to perform, my fingers just won't cooperate. But just now, alone in the quiet, it was like they remembered everything on their own." The conversation was interrupted by more footsteps in the hallway. Word of the unexpected music had begun to spread, and other sisters were quietly making their way to the chapel. They gathered near the doorway, not wanting to intrude, but unable to resist the pull of the beautiful sounds they had heard. David realized that this was becoming something bigger than he had anticipated. What had started as a private moment was turning into a community event. He quietly adjusted his camera angle to capture more of the room. Mother Superior appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. When she saw Sister Margaret at the piano, her face went through a series of emotions: surprise, concern, and then something that looked almost like relief. "Sister Margaret," she said gently, walking into the chapel, "we heard music." "Beautiful music. I'm sorry, Mother Superior," Sister Margaret began, starting to rise from the piano bench. "I know you said I shouldn't play anymore. I was just ... Sit down," Mother Superior said, but her voice was kind rather than stern. "Please, play something else." Sister Margaret looked uncertain. "But what if my hands fail again? What if I embarrass everyone? Then we'll deal with that if it happens," Mother Superior replied. "But right now, I want to hear the music that's been missing from our community for too long." Encouraged by the gentle words, Sister Margaret turned back to the piano. She chose a piece that had always been a favorite during community gatherings, "Morning Has Broken." As her fingers found the keys, the familiar melody filled the chapel once again. But something interesting happened as she played. David noticed that her hands, which had been moving flawlessly when she thought she was alone, began to show small signs of tension as she became aware of her audience. A slight tremor crept into her left hand, and she missed a note in the middle section. Instead of stopping, though, Sister Margaret took a deep breath and kept playing. The mistake seemed to remind her of something important. She closed her eyes, shutting out the watching faces, and focused entirely on the music itself. Immediately, the tremor disappeared. Her hands steadied, and the music flowed out of her with renewed strength and beauty. It was as if closing her eyes had transported her back to that private space where her fingers remembered their training. David found himself thinking about other musicians he had worked with who dealt with performance anxiety. He remembered a violinist who could play perfectly in practice, but fell apart on stage, and a singer whose voice would crack whenever she felt judged. But this seemed different. Sister Margaret's problem wasn't just nerves. It was something more specific. As the song ended, Mother Superior approached the piano bench. "Sister Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. When Dr. Phillips examined your hands last spring, he said you had arthritis that would make playing too difficult. But what I just witnessed doesn't match that diagnosis." Sister Margaret's face crumpled slightly. "I've been wondering about that too. When I'm relaxed, when I'm not thinking about what people expect or whether I'll make mistakes, my hands feel almost normal. But the moment I feel watched or judged, they start to shake and cramp up. Can you play right now with all of us watching? Mother Superior asked. Sister Margaret placed her hands on the keys and began to attempt a simple scale. Almost immediately, her fingers began to tense up. The notes came out uneven, and her right hand developed a slight tremor. Stop, Mother, Superior said gently. Now close your eyes and try again. Sister Margaret closed her eyes and took several deep breaths. When she began the scale again, it was smooth and even. Her hands moved with their natural grace, completely relaxed and controlled. Open your eyes, but look only at the keys, Mother Superior instructed. Sister Margaret did as asked, focusing her gaze downward. The playing remained steady and beautiful. Now, look at me, Mother Superior said. The moment Sister Margaret raised her eyes to meet Mother Superior's gaze, the tremor returned. Her fingers stumbled over the keys, and she pulled her hands away in frustration. It's not arthritis, David said, quietly from his position at the back of the chapel. Everyone turned to look at him, and he realized he had spoken without permission. I'm sorry for interrupting, but I've seen this before in musicians. It's called focal dystonia, sometimes known as musician's dystonia. Mother Superior looked puzzled. What is that? David stood up and walked closer, his camera still recording. It's a neurological condition that affects fine motor control, but only in specific situations. Musicians can develop it when they're under stress or feel performance pressure. The hands work perfectly when they're relaxed, but tense up when the person feels watched or judged. Sister Margaret stared at him. You mean this isn't permanent? I'm not losing my ability to play? Not at all, David said. You never lost your ability. Your brain just learned to associate being watched with danger, so it tries to protect you by making your hands stop working. But when you feel safe and private, like you did a few minutes ago, your natural skill comes through perfectly. The relief that washed over Sister Margaret's face was visible to everyone in the room. Tears began flowing down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sadness. All these months, she said softly, I thought I was broken. I thought my gift was gone forever. Your gift was never gone, Mother Superior said, placing a gentle hand on Sister Margaret's shoulder. We just didn't understand what was happening. Can you forgive an old woman for making the wrong decision? Sister Margaret reached up and covered Mother Superior's hand with her own. There's nothing to forgive. You were trying to protect me. You couldn't have known. David felt a warmth spread through his chest as he watched this moment of reconciliation and understanding. This was why he made documentaries. Not for the technical perfection or the artistic recognition, but for moments like this, when truth emerged and lives were changed. Sister Margaret, he said softly, would you be willing to play one more piece? Something that means a lot to you? She looked around at the faces of her community, these women who had shared her life for more than 4 decades. For the first time in months, she saw not judgment in their eyes, but love and anticipation. Yes, she said, turning back to the piano. I think I'd like that very much. Sister Margaret sat at the piano bench, surrounded by her community for the first time in months. The weight of understanding what had really been happening to her hands felt both liberating and overwhelming. She looked around at the faces of the sisters she had lived and prayed with for decades, seeing nothing but love and encouragement in their eyes. What would you like to hear? She asked softly. Something that speaks to your heart, Mother Superior replied. Something that tells you who you really are. Sister Margaret closed her eyes and let her fingers find the keys. The piece that emerged was one she had composed herself years ago, a gentle melody that had come to her during a particularly difficult time in the convent's history. It was a song about hope surviving through darkness, about finding light even in the most challenging moments. As the music filled the chapel, David continued filming, but he was also thinking about what would happen next. He had captured something extraordinary on camera, something that deserved to be shared with the world. But he also knew that Sister Margaret and her community valued their privacy and peaceful life. The piece ended with a soft, lingering note that seemed to hang in the air long after Sister Margaret's hands left the keys. The silence that followed was filled with awe and gratitude. "That was beautiful," Sister Catherine whispered. "Did you write that yourself?" "A long time ago," Sister Margaret replied. "I had almost forgotten about it." David approached the piano. Carefully. "Sister Margaret, I hope you don't mind me asking, but would you be willing to let me share what happened here tonight? The world needs to see this. People need to know that it's never too late to rediscover your gifts." Sister Margaret looked uncertain. "I don't know about that. We're a quiet community. We don't really seek attention." "I understand," David said. "But think about all the people out there who have been told they're too old, or that they've lost their abilities, or that they should just accept their limitations. Your story could give them hope." Mother Superior stepped forward. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'd like to share the video of Sister Margaret playing tonight. Not for commercial purposes, but to inspire people. To show them that sometimes what we think are permanent limitations are just temporary obstacles that can be overcome with understanding and support." The sisters looked at each other, clearly unsure about exposing their private world to outside scrutiny. Sister Margaret was the most hesitant of all. "I'm 73 years old," she said. "I'm not looking for fame or recognition. I just want to serve my community and live quietly." "And you can continue to do that," David assured her. "But sharing your story doesn't have to change your life here. It just means that your gift could touch people far beyond these walls." After much discussion among the sisters, they agreed to let David share the video, with the understanding that any attention it brought would be handled carefully and respectfully. David uploaded the video 3 days later with a simple title. 73-year-old nun thought she lost her gift forever. Then this happened. He included a brief explanation of Sister Margaret's story and the medical condition that had been misunderstood for so long. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the video had thousands of views. By the end of the first day, it had reached 1 million. Comments poured in from around the world, from people sharing their own stories of being told they were too old or too broken to pursue their dreams. "My grandmother stopped painting when she turned 80 because her family said she was too old," wrote one viewer. "After seeing this, I'm buying her new brushes tomorrow. I'm a retired teacher who always wanted to learn piano, but thought I was too old to start. This video made me sign up for lessons," shared another. The story caught the attention of major news outlets, and soon Sister Margaret found herself receiving interview requests from around the world. Most of these she politely declined, preferring to maintain her quiet life at the convent. But the impact of her story continued to grow. Musicians began reaching out, offering to perform with her or to help raise awareness about focal dystonia. Medical professionals shared the video as an example of how misdiagnosis could rob people of their passions. Music teachers used it to show their students that technical skill was only part of being a musician. The heart and soul were equally important. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from other elderly people who had given up on their dreams. The convent began receiving letters from around the world, from people who had been inspired to pick up instruments they hadn't touched in years, to return to art studios they had abandoned, to pursue passions they thought were lost forever. Sister Margaret read each letter carefully, often with tears in her eyes. She had never imagined that her private moment of rediscovering her gift could have such a profound impact on others. "I feel like I need to do something more," she told Mother Superior one evening. "All these people are reaching out, sharing their stories. I can't just go back to the way things were." Mother Superior had been thinking the same thing. "What did you have in mind?" "I'd like to start giving concerts. Not big, fancy performances, but simple gatherings where people can come and hear music, and maybe find inspiration to pursue their own gifts. We could use any money raised to help fund music education for children who can't afford lessons." The idea grew into something beautiful. The convent began hosting monthly concerts in their chapel, with Sister Margaret as the featured performer. People traveled from hundreds of miles away to attend these intimate gatherings, where the focus was not on technical perfection, but on the joy and healing power of music. David returned several times to document these concerts, creating a follow-up film about the community that had grown around Sister Margaret's story. He watched in amazement as the quiet nun who had thought her musical life was over became a beacon of hope for people around the world. The concerts were unlike any other musical events. Sister Margaret would play classical pieces, hymns, and her own compositions, but she would also invite audience members to share their own stories of rediscovering lost passions. The chapel would fill with tears and laughter as people connected over their shared experiences of overcoming obstacles and refusing to give up on their dreams. One particularly memorable evening, a 90-year-old man brought his violin and played alongside Sister Margaret. He had stopped playing 60 years earlier after a hand injury, but her story had inspired him to try again. The music they made together was imperfect but deeply moving, proving that technical perfection was far less important than genuine expression. Funds raised from these concerts allowed the convent to establish a scholarship program for young musicians from low-income families. Sister Margaret insisted that the scholarships go not just to the most talented students, but to those who showed the greatest love for music, regardless of their current skill level. "Talent can be developed," she would say, "but passion comes from the heart. We want to nurture both." Years passed, and Sister Margaret continued to play and inspire. The video of her rediscovering her gift became a classic, shared millions of times across social media platforms. It was featured in documentaries about aging, resilience, and the power of never giving up on your dreams. But for Sister Margaret herself, the greatest reward wasn't the fame or recognition. It was the simple joy of sitting at the piano each morning, her hands moving across the keys with confidence and grace, making music that brought peace to her community and hope to people around the world. She had learned that sometimes our greatest gifts aren't lost, they're just waiting for the right moment to emerge again. And when they do, they can touch more lives than we ever imagined possible. In her quiet moments, Sister Margaret often thought about that evening when she had slipped into the empty chapel, thinking no one would hear her play. She never could have imagined that her private moment of vulnerability would become a gift to the entire world, proving that it's never too late to rediscover who you're meant to be.